We start today with our study of the new unit on the nervous system. And as always, we're going to look at a case study as a way to kind of think about the ways that the nervous system works when it's functioning properly and contrast that with what happens when things go wrong. So our case study today is a 35-year-old woman who has a cold, basically. She had an upper respiratory infection, and then about a week later, she got some symptoms that were very strange and sudden. She had some tingling and numbness in her extremities, so her hands and feet. And she found that she was really clumsy all of a sudden and was stumbling and tripping. So I want you to think about that as we go forward and look at some of these next slides, and think about the structures and the functions of the nervous system that we're going to look at, and try to identify, if you can, where some of those problems can arise. So let's look at our next slide. And here we have the functions of the nervous system. So three main processes that the nervous system does for us. And really it's about gathering information from the environment. And it does this through various kinds of sensory receptors. Here you see an eye, so there are visual receptors that gather information. And then that sensory information gets passed to the integration unit, which would be the brain and the spinal cord, where that information is processed. And then there's some kind of motor response. The integration system decides if action is required, and then it responds to that information. So main function is gathering of information. It's going to be monitoring changes that occur outside and inside the body. Sometimes there are stimuli from within the body itself. And then there's going to be integration or decision-making process when that sensory input is interpreted. And then there's going to be motor output. So there's some kind of response to that stimuli. And the response can activate either muscles or glands. And we're going to look at the different subdivisions of this particular motor response, because there are two categories. You have the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary, so you can consciously control it. And then you have the autonomic nervous system, which is where our involuntary, unconscious motor responses occur. Nervous tissue itself has two types of cells. So you have the support cells, which are called neuroglia. And neuroglia essentially means nerve glue. Neuro meaning nervous system. Glia is the glue. So those support cells are really what hold the nervous tissue together and support the next category of cells, which are the neurons. So let's look first at the nervous tissue that has the role of supporting the neurons. So those are our neuroglia. And there's several different types of cells that fall in this category. Astrocytes are the first that we will look at. And these are star-shaped cells. So hence the prefix astro. You can kind of think of that. Astro means astronomy. That particular prefix is associated with stars, right? So these are star-shaped cells. And astrocytes are really important for not only anchoring and supporting the neurons. So the neuron is here in yellow. And you can see that there's these attachment sites here where the astrocytes are bonded and support those cells. But it also has a role in controlling or regulating the chemical environment of the brain. Astrocytes have a role in mopping up chemicals that leak out of neurons and into the space between cells. So ions that have leaked out, or neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about in more detail later on. The second category of support cells are the microglia. And microglia are kind of spider-shaped cells here, again, within and between the neurons. And the role of these cells is really to dispose of debris. So disposing of bacteria, for instance, that might find their way somehow into those spaces between nerve cells. So they're phagocytes. Then we have the last category, ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are actually an epithelial tissue, and they have projections here. You can see the little cilia like hair coming out of those ependymal cells. And those cilia are going to be lining the fluid-filled cavities within the brain and spinal cord. So ventricles inside of the brain or the central canal in the spinal cord. And they help to circulate that cerebrospinal fluid and move the fluid across the surface. So now we're ready to talk about the neurons, the actual nerve cells which make up most of the nervous tissue. And these are the cells that are specialized to transmit messages. So these are the communication cells of the nervous tissue. And we're going to look at some different regions of neurons so that you have an idea of the geography of that particular kind of cell. So the first part we'll look at is the cell body, which is the place where most of the metabolic activity happens inside that cell. That's where you're going to find the nucleus with the DNA inside of it, and most of the other organelles within that nerve cell. Then you have processes that come off the main cell body. And these are fibers that are going to extend from that cell body in a number of different directions. And they have different names depending on what order or what direction that information is moving into or out of the cell. So let's look at the neuron anatomy for a second here. Here is the cell body, and you can see the dark purplish colored nucleus there in the center. But then there's a number of other structures around the nucleus, and you can see these little blue granules. Those are called Nissl bodies, and they're really just a specialized type of rough endoplasmic reticulum inside of nerve cells. And there happens to be quite a bit of it, and it gives that cell kind of a striped appearance in the cell body. Then there are also quite a number of neurofibrils here. They're very fine cytoskeleton elements that help the cell maintain its shape. Within the nucleus, you can see a pretty pronounced nucleolus there, which is where ribosome manufacture happens. Then there are extensions that project outside the cell body, and we just talked about those a moment ago. You have two different types of extensions. You have dendrites here, these finer yellow projections. And these are the ones that are going to conduct impulses toward the cell body. So here's where information is being gathered from other neurons, and then it's being sent towards the cell body, and then eventually will be conducted away from the cell body in the axon structure here. So dendrites conduct information towards the cell body, axons carry that information away from the cell body.